Look at the skyline of present-day Cairo. You will see thousands of minarets and stone domes reaching into the sky. Now step back into the 13th century to the markets along the shores of the Black Sea. There, young boys bound in iron chains stand waiting to be sold. The thread connecting those enslaved lives to Cairo's magnificent skyline is the Mamluk era. For nearly 3 centuries, Cairo was ruled by men of slave origin. But this is not merely the story of an unusual dynasty. This is a story of how violence, faith, commerce, and architecture converged to forge a new city after the old world collapsed. Today, we will walk through markets that still carry the scent of cloves from 6 centuries ago to understand how slaves reclaimed their destiny and altered the course of history. Let us begin. Everything began with a catastrophe that defined the age. In 1258, Baghdad fell beneath the hooves of the Mongol cavalry. The wind sweeping across Mesopotamia carried the scent of burning paper and blood. Mongol forces breached the city walls, reducing the crown jewel of the Abbasid Empire to ashes. The Tigris River ran black with the ink of countless manuscripts cast from the House of Wisdom, and then red with the blood of hundreds of thousands of its people. The ancient center of the Islamic world was obliterated. From those ashes, a human tide began to shift westward. Among them were scholars, merchants, clerics, soldiers, and ordinary people desperate for sanctuary. Carrying the remnants of a shattered world, they converged on a city situated along the Nile. They sought refuge in Cairo. But the Cairo they entered was no longer an Islamic capital in the traditional sense. The city stood intact, even thriving. Yet the men occupying the throne possessed neither royal blood nor the traditional right of succession from the Ayyubid dynasty. They were the Mamluks. In Arabic, Mamluk translates to one who is owned. Most of them were once Turkic or Circassian boys from the Eurasian steppes and the Caucasus Mountains, sold to the sultans and Egyptian nobility. Here they were forced to convert to Islam and undergo rigorous training in horsemanship, archery, and close-quarters combat. This system produced an elite warrior class. They were loyal to their buyers, but also bound to one another by a brotherhood forged through violence, discipline, and survival. However, when the entire military power of the state is placed in the hands of an organized, armed, and ambitious class that is untethered to any native lineage, sooner or later they would realize they did not have to serve forever. In 1250, this force began to rebel. The Mamluks overthrew the final Ayyubid. Sultan discarded their former masters and seized the Egyptian throne for themselves. From that moment, Cairo became the capital of an empire governed by soldiers who had once been slaves. That is also what made the Mamluk state both powerful and fragile. It was powerful because it was built upon a battle-hardened and ambitious military class. But it was fragile because power was not rooted in stable bloodlines. Every sultan had to constantly negotiate with bribes, suppress, or balance the military factions beneath him. To maintain the obedience of the generals, the court implemented a land distribution system known as Iqta. You can picture it as a contractual exchange of interest. The sultan did not pay salaries in coin. Instead, he granted his commanders the right to collect taxes from the fertile wheat fields along the Nile. In return, they had to maintain a proportional cavalry force, always ready for war. Land in exchange for swords. Revenue dictated the balance of power. Whoever harvested more wheat and sustained more troops held a louder voice in Cairo. It was an efficient system, but its true value would only be revealed when pushed to a life-or-death test. And that test arrived swiftly. In 1260, the Mongol army advanced into the Levant, directly threatening Egypt's borders. Rather than adopting a defensive stance, the Mamluks marched across the Sinai Desert. At the valley of Ain Jalut, the two most formidable cavalry forces of the era clashed. Dust obscured the sun. The Mongol cavalry, accustomed to hit-and-run archery tactics, could not withstand the heavily armored Mamluk cavalry. The Mongol advance was completely halted in a single battle on the plains. The Mamluks had successfully defended the Egyptian frontier, preserving the last hope of Islamic civilization. The Mamluks possessed an army. They had military triumphs. They held de facto power. What they lacked was legitimacy. In the eyes of many religious scholars and locals, they were still foreigners of slave descent. To govern a territory stretching from the Nile to Syria, military might had to be coupled with a legitimate veneer of faith. The Mamluks found their answer in the very ruins of Baghdad. Following the city's fall, the Mamluks brought a surviving member of the Abbasid dynasty to Cairo. They draped him in the traditional black mantle, conducted solemn ceremonies, and proclaimed him the caliph, the supreme spiritual leader. Naturally, this caliph held practically no real power. He did not command troops, collect taxes, or govern the state. His role was to grant the sultan's decrees a layer of religious legitimacy. Through this maneuver, Cairo seamlessly rose to become the new political and spiritual heart, filling the void left by Baghdad. With the borders secured and the throne cloaked in religious authority, the Mamluk leaders turned their attention to the recognition of posterity. That was when Cairo entered an architectural renaissance. Looking at Cairo's skyline, you will observe hundreds of minarets and soaring domes intersecting one another. The sky is a realm directed toward the divine, yet also a stage for individuals to project their authority. Every sultan, vizier, and prominent general sought to leave a mark. They constructed mausoleum schools, mosques, hospitals, fountains, and vast religious and civic complexes. They transformed the city into a map of prestige. Walk along the Bain al-Qasrain thoroughfare. There, the architectural complex of Sultan Qalawun, completed in 1285, stands imposing. This complex integrates three major structures: a magnificent domed mausoleum, ensuring the people would always remember the name Qalawun; a grand madrasa to sponsor and maintain influence over the scholarly elite; and a vast Bimaristan hospital providing free treatment to thousands of patients daily. Moving into the 14th century, this architectural rivalry culminated in the Mosque of Sultan Hassan. With its massive windowless ground floor stone walls and structural blocks casting shadows over the central courtyard, it resembles a fortress. Situated near the citadel, its sheer scale forces anyone standing at its base to gaze upward in awe. It projected authority through towering stone. Yet concealed beneath those domes and minarets was the imperative to secure wealth. Mamluk politics was rife with factional disputes. A commander might be at the pinnacle of power today, but could lose everything tomorrow upon his downfall. His wealth, estates, properties, and revenues could easily be confiscated by the state. In such a volatile political landscape, the elite had to find a way to make their wealth harder to seize. They achieved this through the Waqf charitable endowments. Under Islamic law, properties endowed to religious trusts in perpetuity became sacred assets. The state could not confiscate them. Therefore, generals used their gold and silver to construct monumental mosques, then transferred their agricultural estates, public baths, and commercial shops into the Waqf trust to fund the mosque's operations. Subsequently, they appointed their own descendants as administrators of the trust, securing them a lifelong income from the generated revenue. For this reason, Mamluk architecture possesses a very distinct depth. It was simultaneously an expression of faith an instrument of political power and an economic strategy. After admiring the soaring domes, lower your gaze to the streets below, where the true pulse that gave the city its vitality was kept. Cairo was a vibrant, bustling city, heavily defined by commerce. Step into a caravanserai or the artisanal streets. The first thing you notice is the scent. Cairo was steeped in the aromas of black pepper, cinnamon cloves, and nutmeg. The city served as a vital transit hub linking the east and the west, relying on the Indian Ocean monsoons. Fleets loaded with spices from India and Southeast Asia docked at Aden and sailed up the Red Sea. Goods were unloaded, packed onto the backs of thousands of camels, crossing the arid desert to reach the banks of the Nile. From there, they floated downstream to warehouses in Cairo, before being sold at a premium to Venetian and Genoese merchants in the Mediterranean. The Mamluk government levied taxes on every ounce of spice passing through their territory. This commercial flow provided abundant funding to sustain their cavalry and construct their grand domes. To keep this complex engine of commerce running smoothly, Cairo needed someone to maintain order in the markets. That role belonged to the mutasib, the market inspector. Imagine him leading his guards through the market stalls. He stops at a butcher's stall, placing a standard weight on the scales to ensure accuracy. He smells the barrels of milk to detect water dilution. He orders the removal of awnings, obstructing public walkways. The mutasib was the bridge between regulations on paper and the loud, crowded, aromatic life of the Cairene markets. Eventually, the prosperity relying on the flow of goods and people in Cairo began to expose its vulnerabilities. By the mid-14th century, the cracks began to show. The first major crisis came from disease. In 1347, the plague, the Black Death, swept into Egypt. It took root and returned in lingering cycles for a century and a half. The streets grew silent. Carts piled with the stricken rolled out of the city gates each night. The labor force was severely depleted. A dwindling population meant fewer hands to sow the fields along the Nile. Wheat became scarce. Food prices skyrocketed. Revenues from the Iqta system plummeted, driving military factions to fight even more ruthlessly over the dwindling resources. Faced with economic hardship, the sultans chose to mint debased copper coins to pay the army. Inflation surged. Ineffective monetary policies and a corrupt bureaucracy tormented the populace. In other words, Cairo retained its outward splendor, but internally, the Mamluk machine was growing increasingly exhausted. Despite facing numerous internal issues, the Mamluk state sustained itself through its monopoly on the spice trade. But then the world shifted direction once more, and this time the change did not come from the deserts or the steppes. It came from the sea. In 1498, the Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama discovered a maritime route around Africa's Cape of Good Hope, leading directly to India. This meant European merchants could now access Eastern goods without transiting through Egypt. The impact hit rapidly. Records show that in the late 15th century, warehouses at the port of Alexandria were still packed with pepper. But just 5 years later, dust gathered on empty docks. Foreign merchants struggled to scrape together meager loads for their ships. The Mamluk state lost one of its most critical sources of income. Depleted of finances and manpower, and lagging in weapons technology, the dynasty slowly entered its final days. In 1517, the Ottoman army advanced into Egypt. At the Battle of Redania, on the outskirts of Cairo, Mamluk cavalry charged forward on horseback, brandishing swords as their ancestors had done at Ain Jalut. But the era had changed. Their bravery shattered against the overwhelming firepower of the Ottomans. The Ottoman Empire entered Cairo. The Mamluk dynasty concluded its 267-year rule amidst smoke and sporadic gunfire in the streets. Cairo became merely a provincial capital of the Ottoman Empire. Although the Mamluk dynasty had ended, the physical form of the city was preserved. Walking through the alleys of historic Cairo today, the imprint of the Mamluk era remains vivid. The ingenuity of the Waqf laws inadvertently sealed the architecture against time, keeping the mosques and mausoleums standing firm. The markets, still bearing the names of coppersmith and weaver guilds, continue the ancient rhythms of life. The trade routes wind past dark stone blocks. Thousands of minarets remain decisive brushstrokes across the city sky. You are looking at the legacy of one of the most unusual ruling classes in history. Men who were once bought and sold as property ultimately built one of the most important cities in the Islamic world. They did not forge an immortal dynasty, but they forced history to remember their name through the very skyline of Cairo. I am Robert Langdon from History Reconstruction. If this journey has offered you some valuable perspectives, do not forget to leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel. I will see you in the next chapter of history.